In the blazing heat of an August morning in 216 BCE, the fate of the ancient world hung by a thread. On the dusty plains near a small Italian village called Cannae, two colossal armies faced each other in what would become the most devastating single day of combat in human history. On one side stood the might of Rome, the rising superpower that had conquered half the Mediterranean. Their legions stretched as far as the eye could see, banners fluttering in the hot wind, shields glinting like a sea of bronze and steel. Never before had the Roman Republic assembled such a massive force, 86,000 of their finest soldiers ready to crush their enemies once and for all. But across the narrow plain, a smaller army waited in deadly silence. Led by a Carthaginian general whose very name struck terror into Roman hearts, this force of barely 50,000 men would orchestrate a masterpiece of tactical brilliance so devastating, so perfectly executed, that it would be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. This was Hannibal Barca, the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants, the nightmare that haunted Roman dreams. And on this scorching day, he would deliver a blow so catastrophic that it nearly brought the greatest empire in history to its knees. What unfolded at Cannae was not just a battle. It was a slaughter of such epic proportions that 20% of Rome's fighting men would perish in a single afternoon. Entire bloodlines would be wiped out. The Roman Senate would lose nearly a third of its members in one day. The screams of the dying would echo across the Italian countryside as the most powerful army ever assembled by Rome was systematically annihilated by a brilliant tactical trap. But how did it come to this? How did Rome, master of the Mediterranean, find itself staring into the abyss at the hands of a foreign invader? The answer lies in the audacious journey of one man whose hatred for Rome burned so fiercely that he would risk everything on the most impossible military gamble in history. The seeds of this catastrophe were planted years before, when young Hannibal knelt before his father Hamilcar and swore an oath that would echo through eternity. With his hand on the altar of the gods, the boy promised eternal hatred for Rome, a vow that would drive him to attempt the impossible. For Carthage had been humiliated in the First Punic War, stripped of Sicily, forced to pay crushing tribute to their Roman conquerors. The proud maritime empire that had once ruled the western Mediterranean now existed at Rome's mercy. But Hannibal Barca, the lightning, had not forgotten, and neither would his son. When Hannibal assumed command of Carthaginian forces in Spain, he was already plotting something that would shake the foundations of the Roman world. While Rome's senators debated politics in their marble halls, believing themselves secure behind their Italian borders, Hannibal was preparing for the most audacious military campaign in history. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would march across the Alps themselves, bringing war to the very heart of Roman territory with an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. The crossing of the Alps in 218 BCE stands as one of history's most remarkable military achievements. Hannibal's force was massive, numbering 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, those legendary beasts from North Africa whose trumpeting roars would terrorize Roman soldiers. The journey through the mountains was a nightmare of freezing temperatures, treacherous passes, and hostile tribes. Men and animals perished by the thousands as they struggled through narrow defiles where a single misstep meant death. The elephants, creatures of the African sun, suffered terribly in the alpine cold. Hannibal himself lost the sight in one eye to frostbite and infection. Yet somehow, impossibly, they emerged from the mountains into the Po Valley. When the Roman scouts brought word that Hannibal had actually crossed the Alps, panic seized the capital. It was as if the gods themselves had turned against Rome. How could mere mortals traverse those frozen peaks with an entire army? The elephants alone seemed like creatures from another world, and their appearance on Italian soil sent shockwaves through every Roman settlement. Hannibal's arrival in northern Italy marked the beginning of a campaign that would test Rome's very survival. At the river Trebia, he lured the Roman legions into an ambush, crushing them with a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological warfare. The Romans had never faced an enemy like this, someone who could outthink their generals and turn their own strengths against them. At Lake Trasimene, he struck again, catching an entire Roman army in the morning mist and annihilating them in one of history's most perfect ambushes. 15,000 Romans died, including their consul, and another 15,000 were captured. Rome reeled under these hammer blows. For the first time in centuries, enemy soldiers were marching freely through Roman territory, burning farms, capturing cities, and demonstrating to Rome's Italian allies that the Republic could no longer protect them. Panic gripped the capital as refugees poured in with tales of Hannibal's unstoppable advance. The Senate appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man whose strategy of avoiding direct confrontation earned him the nickname the Delayer. Fabius understood what many Romans could not accept. Hannibal was simply too dangerous to face in open battle. The Carthaginian general had proven twice that he could outmaneuver and destroy Roman armies through superior tactics. Instead, Fabius adopted a strategy of attrition, shadowing Hannibal's army, cutting off his supplies, denying him the decisive battle he needed to end the war. It was a sound strategy, but it required patience, and patience was not a Roman virtue. For months, Hannibal marched through Italy, while Fabius followed at a distance, never allowing himself to be drawn into battle. The strategy was working, slowly wearing down the Carthaginian forces through hunger and exhaustion. But the Roman people grew increasingly frustrated. Their enemies were ravaging their lands while their own armies seemed afraid to fight. Roman honor demanded action, not this shameful game of cat and mouse. When new consuls were elected in 216 BCE, the stage was set for disaster. Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paullus represented two different approaches to the Hannibal problem. Paullus was cautious, having learned from the previous defeats, but Varro was aggressive, promising the Roman people the decisive victory they craved. The Senate, tired of Fabian delays, authorized the largest army in Roman history. 8 full legions plus allied troops, a force so massive that it dwarfed anything Rome had ever fielded. This was to be the end of Hannibal's rampage. The Carthaginian army, worn down by months of campaigning, would be crushed by sheer numbers. Roman military doctrine was straightforward, based on discipline, training, and the irresistible momentum of the legion. They would advance in tight formation, shields locked, gladii thrusting, and sweep the barbarians from the field through superior Roman virtus. But Hannibal had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had spent years studying Roman tactics, learning their strengths and weaknesses, preparing for the day when Roman pride would overcome Roman caution. When he seized the vital supply depot at Cannae, he was not just depriving the Romans of grain and provisions, he was laying a trap that would lure them into battle on his terms, in the place of his choosing, where their numerical advantage would become their greatest weakness. The morning of August 2nd, 216 BCE, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the assembled armies like the weight of destiny itself. The air shimmered above the dusty plains as 86,000 Roman soldiers prepared for what they believed would be their greatest triumph. Consul Varro, commanding on this fateful day, surveyed his massive host with satisfaction. Here was Roman power in all its terrible glory, rank upon rank of legionaries stretching beyond the horizon, their armor gleaming, their standards proud against the burning sky. The Romans had learned nothing from their previous defeats. In their minds, Trebia and Trasimene had been flukes, tricks played by a clever barbarian who would finally meet his match against the full might of Rome. They deployed in their traditional formation, but deeper than ever before, believing that sheer weight of numbers would smash through any defense Hannibal could devise. The legions packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, a human battering ram of bronze and steel that would crush everything in its path. But across the narrow field, Hannibal watched with the calm eyes of a master craftsman about to unveil his greatest work. He had positioned his forces with meticulous care, every unit placed not for glory but for function. The hot Libeccio wind blew directly into Roman faces, filling their eyes with dust and sand, while his own men had the wind at their backs. The river Aufidus secured one flank, forcing the Romans into an even tighter formation. Every element of the battlefield had been calculated, every advantage seized. Hannibal's army was a patchwork of nations united under his genius. Gallic warriors with their long swords and fierce war cries stood beside Spanish infantry with their deadly falcata blades. Numidian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the world, waited on the flanks like wolves preparing to hunt. African veterans, survivors of a dozen campaigns, gripped their captured Roman weapons with deadly familiarity. This was not just an army, it was a weapon forged in the furnace of war and tempered by Hannibal's tactical brilliance. The Carthaginian formation seemed almost casual compared to the rigid Roman deployment. In the center, Hannibal placed his Gallic and Spanish troops, deliberately arranging them in a slight convex curve that bulged toward the enemy. To Roman eyes, this looked like weakness, an invitation to attack. But on the flanks, hidden from Roman view, stood the real teeth of Hannibal's trap. His African veterans, the most experienced soldiers in his army, waited in perfect discipline while the heavy cavalry took position on the wings. When the trumpet sounded and the Roman advance began, it was like watching a great machine lumber into motion. 80,000 men stepped forward as one, their hobnailed sandals drumming against the earth in perfect rhythm. The ground trembled under their march, and dust clouds rose behind them like the smoke of some vast funeral pyre. This was the moment of truth, when Roman discipline and courage would be tested against Carthaginian cunning. The initial collision was thunderous. Roman shields crashed against Gallic swords, Spanish points thrust at Roman throats, and the air filled with the screams of dying men and the clash of bronze on iron. The Gallic center, fighting with desperate courage, began to give ground under the relentless Roman pressure. Step by step they retreated, their line bending inward like a bow being drawn. To the Romans, it looked like victory. Their formation was working, driving deep into enemy territory, splitting Hannibal's army in half. But this retreat was no rout. Every step backward was controlled, measured, part of a deadly choreography that Hannibal had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. The Gauls and Spanish fought magnificently, trading ground for time, bleeding the Romans while drawing them ever deeper into the trap. As the Roman center pressed forward in triumph, their formation grew longer and thinner, stretched like a snake pursuing its prey into a narrow burrow. Meanwhile, on the flanks, catastrophe was unfolding for Rome. Hannibal's heavy cavalry, led by his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, smashed into the Roman horse with devastating effect. The Roman cavalry, never their strong suit, crumbled almost immediately under the assault of these veteran warriors. In minutes, Rome's mounted arm was scattered to the winds, leaving the infantry's flanks completely exposed. The Numidian light cavalry on the opposite wing engaged in their traditional hit-and-run tactics, keeping the Italian allied horse busy while the real destruction unfolded elsewhere. These desert warriors were masters of mounted warfare, striking like lightning and vanishing like smoke, always just out of reach but never allowing their enemies a moment's peace. As the Roman center drove deeper into Hannibal's deliberately weakening line, the trap began to close. The African infantry, silent and disciplined as death itself, wheeled inward from both flanks. These were no barbarian warriors fighting for glory. They were professionals, veterans of countless campaigns, armed with captured Roman equipment and trained in Roman tactics. They knew exactly what they were doing as they closed the jaws of the trap. The moment of realization came slowly to the Romans. First, confusion, as their officers tried to understand why enemy soldiers were appearing on their flanks. Then growing alarm as they realized they were being surrounded. Finally, pure terror as the truth became clear. They were not winning this battle. They were being systematically destroyed. Hannibal's cavalry, having scattered the Roman horse, now swept behind the enemy formation to complete the encirclement. The Romans found themselves pressed together in an ever-shrinking pocket, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear. The killing ground was prepared, and the slaughter was about to begin. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. Packed so tightly they could barely lift their weapons, the Romans became helpless targets for Carthaginian spears and swords. Men were trampled by their own comrades, suffocated in the crush of bodies, or simply hacked down where they stood. The proud legions that had marched out that morning in perfect formation were now a writhing mass of panic and desperation. Consul Paullus, the more cautious of the two commanders, died fighting in the melee, cut down while trying to rally his men. Around him fell the flower of Roman nobility, senators and equites who had come to witness what they thought would be their greatest triumph. The standards of Rome, symbols of her power and glory, were trampled into the blood-soaked earth. The screams of the dying filled the air as Rome's greatest army was torn apart like wheat before the scythe. In the center of this hellish carnage, Roman soldiers pressed so tightly together they could not even fall when struck down. Bodies remained upright, held in place by the crushing weight of their comrades, while Carthaginian weapons found their marks again and again. The dust turned to mud beneath their feet, soaked crimson with the blood of tens of thousands. Hannibal himself rode through the chaos, his one good eye surveying the destruction with cold satisfaction. This was what he had dreamed of since that day he knelt before his father's altar. This was his answer to Roman arrogance, his gift to the gods who demanded vengeance for Carthage's humiliation. Every Roman death was a prayer answered, every broken legion a step closer to the justice his people deserved. The heat of the August sun beat down mercilessly on the killing field, but it was nothing compared to the furnace of Hannibal's hatred. For years he had planned this moment, calculating every move, preparing every contingency. The Romans had walked into his trap with all the blind confidence of a people who believed themselves masters of the world. Now they were learning the price of that arrogance in blood and agony. Some Roman officers tried desperately to break through the encirclement, leading small groups of men in doomed charges against the Carthaginian ring. But there was no escape from this carefully constructed tomb. Hannibal's veterans met every assault with disciplined precision, their shields locked, their spears thrusting forward in deadly rhythm. The Africans fought with the calm professionalism of men who had seen 100 battlefields, while the Gauls and Spanish warriors howled their war cries as they cut down the trapped legionaries. The Numidian cavalry darted in and out of the melee like hunting wolves, their javelins finding targets among any Romans who tried to flee. These desert warriors had perfected the art of mounted warfare over generations, and they showed no mercy to the broken remnants of Rome's mounted force. Horses screamed and fell, their riders crushed beneath them or pierced by African spears. As the sun reached its peak, the slaughter intensified. Roman discipline, the foundation of their military success, crumbled under the psychological horror of total encirclement. Men who had stood firm in a dozen battles now broke and ran, only to find themselves pressed back into the killing ground by their own terrified comrades. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the din of combat. Standards fell as their bearers were cut down, the sacred eagles of Rome tumbling into the dust. The younger Romans, many fighting their first major battle, wept openly as they died. These were boys who had dreamed of glory, of following in the footsteps of their fathers and grandfathers who had built the empire. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where courage meant nothing and numbers counted for less than nothing. Their blood mingled with that of grizzled veterans who had conquered half the Mediterranean, all of them equal now in death. Consul Varro, the architect of this disaster, fought his way to the edge of the encirclement with a small band of cavalry. Unlike his co-consul Paullus, who had died with honor among his men, Varro chose survival over glory. He spurred his horse through the Carthaginian lines and fled toward the town of Venusia, leaving behind the greatest army Rome had ever assembled to die in the August heat. The irony was not lost on Hannibal. The Romans, so proud of their military machine, had been destroyed by their own greatest strength. Their discipline had made them predictable, their courage had made them reckless, and their numbers had made them vulnerable. They had marched into battle believing that Roman virtus would triumph over barbarian cunning, and instead found themselves outsmarted by a general who understood war as both art and science. As afternoon wore on toward evening, the killing began to slow. Not from mercy, but from simple exhaustion. The Carthaginians had been slaughtering Romans for hours, and even the strongest arm grows weary from such work. The field was carpeted with bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep in places, a monument to tactical genius and strategic folly. The survivors, perhaps 10,000 Romans who had somehow escaped the initial encirclement, huddled in 2 nearby camps, wounded and demoralized beyond description. They had witnessed the annihilation of their entire army, seen their greatest generals cut down, watched their sacred standards trampled into the earth. Many wept for fallen brothers, sons, and fathers. Others simply stared into nothing, their minds broken by the magnitude of the catastrophe. Hannibal's own losses were remarkably light, perhaps 6,000 men from his army of 50,000. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. Roman sources would later claim that 70,000 of their soldiers died that day, while others put the number at 55,000. Whatever the exact count, the scale of destruction was unprecedented in the annals of warfare. Among the Roman dead lay the cream of their society. 29 of the 48 military tribunes had perished, along with 80 men of senatorial rank. These were not just soldiers, but the political and social elite of Rome, men whose families had guided the Republic for generations. Their deaths would leave a void in Roman leadership that would take decades to fill. The news of Cannae spread across Italy like wildfire, carried by terrified refugees and deserting allies. In Rome itself, panic seized the population as word arrived of the unthinkable disaster. Women filled the temples, weeping for their lost husbands and sons, while senators debated whether the city could even be defended. Some spoke of abandoning Rome entirely, of fleeing across the sea to start anew. But perhaps the most devastating blow was not the immediate casualties, but the psychological impact. For centuries, Romans had believed themselves invincible, chosen by the gods to rule the world. They had conquered Gauls and Greeks, Samnites and Etruscans, building an empire through discipline, courage, and an unshakable faith in their destiny. Cannae shattered that faith like glass against stone. Across Italy, Rome's allies began to waver. Capua, the second largest city in the peninsula, opened its gates to Hannibal within months. Other cities followed, calculating that Roman power was broken forever. The carefully constructed alliance system that had given Rome control of Italy began to crumble as local leaders hedged their bets with the Carthaginian conqueror. Even beyond Italy, the shockwaves of Cannae were felt. King Philip of Macedon, watching from across the Adriatic, saw an opportunity to strike at Roman interests in the east. He signed an alliance with Hannibal, opening a second front that would stretch Roman resources even thinner. In Sicily, Greek cities that had chafed under Roman rule began to plot rebellion, sensing that their moment of liberation had arrived. Yet, for all its tactical brilliance and strategic impact, Cannae contained the seeds of its own limitations. Hannibal had destroyed a Roman army, but he had not destroyed Rome itself. The city still stood, its walls intact, its people defiant despite their grief. The Romans had learned a bitter lesson about overconfidence, but they had not learned surrender. In the aftermath of the battle, a remarkable transformation began to take place in Roman society. The disaster forced them to abandon their traditional tactics and adopt new strategies. They returned to the Fabian approach of avoiding pitched battles, instead focusing on cutting Hannibal's supply lines and denying him the decisive engagements he needed. It was a humbling retreat from their aggressive traditions, but it was also the beginning of their eventual victory. The Roman capacity for resilience, forged over centuries of warfare, now faced its ultimate test. They had lost an army, but they still had the resources of Italy and the determination of a people who refused to accept defeat. The war would continue for another 14 years, but the Romans who emerged from Cannae were different from those who had marched out that August morning. They were wiser, more cautious, and ultimately more dangerous. Hannibal had won the greatest tactical victory in military history, but he had also awakened a sleeping giant. The Romans would not make the same mistakes again. They would learn from their defeat, adapt their strategies, and eventually turn their humiliation into the foundation of even greater conquests. Cannae was not just the story of a battle won and lost. It was the crucible in which the future masters of the Mediterranean were forged through blood and fire. The blood-soaked field of Cannae would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. But in that moment of supreme triumph, Hannibal faced a choice that would echo through history. His officers urged him to march on Rome immediately, while the capital lay defenseless and paralyzed with terror. "Give me the cavalry," pleaded Hannibal, his most trusted lieutenant, "and in 5 days you shall dine in the capital." The road to Rome stretched open before them, defended only by the ghosts of the legions that lay rotting in the August Sunday. But Hannibal hesitated. His army, though victorious, was exhausted from the slaughter. His men needed rest, his wounded required care, and his supplies were running dangerously low after months of campaigning in hostile territory. More critically, he lacked the siege equipment necessary to break down Rome's massive walls. The Carthaginian general, for all his tactical genius, had never been equipped for a siege of such magnitude. His strength lay in movement, in striking like lightning and vanishing like smoke. The irony of Cannae lingers through the centuries like the dust of that August battlefield. Hannibal had achieved the impossible, orchestrating the most perfect tactical victory in military history, yet victory itself became his prison. That moment of hesitation before Rome's walls would define the fate of two civilizations. The Romans, bloodied but not broken, would rise from the ashes of their greatest defeat to forge an empire that would endure for 1,000 years. And Hannibal, the genius who had brought Rome to its knees, would be remembered not as a conqueror, but as the man who proved that even perfect victories can lead to ultimate defeat when strategy fails to match tactical brilliance.